This is going to be a fairly informal video, mostly just my speculation and rambling about a subject I've always found quite interesting: the surviving and attested non-Indo-European languages in Europe. With the exception of the Uralic languages of northeastern and central Europe, and Basque in the Pyrenees region, all contemporary European languages belong to the Indo-European family, which also includes the languages of Iran and parts of India, and is the most widely spoken language family in existence. Uralic languages, such as Hungarian, are most likely the product of later migrations or invasions from the steppe, but Basque is more of a mystery. The language of Basque can be found in the Pyrenees region of Spain and the extreme south of France. Though Basque is still spoken today, most now extinct non-Indo-European languages were also found in southern Europe. Though a part of this may be just because of their proximity to the more literate Mediterranean world, I think there is more to it than that. To start, I think it's important to briefly go over the history of prehistoric Europe. Agriculture spread west from the Aegean region, starting around 7000 BCE, with a population known as Anatolian or early European farmers. They merged with the pre-existing hunter-gatherers, known as Western hunter-gatherers, and created the cultures of Old Europe, which spanned the European Neolithic. After this time, during the Bronze Age, at around 2500 BCE, it is hypothesized that Yamnaya steppe people moved into Europe from the Pontic steppe, almost certainly bringing Indo-European languages with them. Though it is difficult to know for sure, it seems like southern Europe was subject to the imposition of a largely male warrior elite, which resulted in cultural and linguistic change. For example, in ancient Iberia, the male lineage was largely replaced, though the overall majority of ancestry continued to be of Neolithic farmer stock. In comparison, in parts of northern Europe at least, there was much more of a replacement, such as Britain, where around 90% of the entire Neolithic population was replaced during the Bronze Age at around 2500 BCE. This was possibly a result of the spread of disease or famine. Much like how Native Americans in North America died in massive numbers of disease long before English settlers reached their lands. Though of course violence certainly may have played a role, I have a hard time believing that simple societies with only early bronze weapons could have conducted such a thorough ethnic cleansing. Agriculture had been established in the Mediterranean for much longer than the north of Europe, so it would make sense if these societies were larger, more organized, and resilient. Even though they were probably conquered by the Indo-European speaking newcomers, enough of the old population survived and would have been able to keep their languages alive in at least isolated areas. It's hard to imagine, for example, the Bell Beaker people coming into Britain would have had any inclination to pick up the language of the old population who had largely died out. Thus, although southern Europe would eventually come to speak mostly Indo-European languages, non-Indo-European tongues would persist into the historical period and the present. There are several attested non-Indo-European languages in southern Europe. For example, Minoan, an ancient language present on the Greek island of Crete. Crete and other nearby Greek islands were probably the first area of Europe where these Aegean farmers took root, and thus it makes sense that Minoa was the site of what is often considered the first real European civilization. As far as I know, their language of Linear A has not yet been translated, but Crete seems to be home to an advanced people well before the arrival of Indo-European speaking peoples in the region. Likewise, There is Etruscan, the language of perhaps the first mainland Italian civilization. I would not really say that it is pre-Indo-European, as a distinctly Etruscan urban culture really only emerged during the Iron Age, as far as I know. To an extent, it influenced later Roman civilization, and thus elements of Etruscan were carried forward. Some have suggested that the Etruscans were of Lydian origin in modern-day Turkey, but I feel like this is unlikely, as Anatolia was Indo-Europeanized fairly early, and Lydian is a relatively well-attested Indo-European language. I think that the Etruscans were probably largely of local Italian origin, but certainly influenced by Eastern Mediterranean cultures of the Aegean and Levant. This may have been why some classical authors attributed them to an Eastern origin, but this is speculation on my part. Much more mysterious is the language of ancient Sardinia associated with the Nuragic civilization. It has been hypothesized by Cambridge historian David Abulafia that later attested Sardinian languages contain a pre-Indo-European substratum, possibly related to Basque, which could have been part of a larger pre-Indo-European West Mediterranean language family. Though I do not know enough to say for sure, it does make intuitive sense to me, as Sardinians are considered to be the genetically closest to the original Neolithic European farmers. It seems plausible, if not probable, that their language would have survived for longer. Furthermore, it does seem like Bronze Age Nuragic Sardinians had a society that was fairly advanced and complex compared to other West Mediterranean areas at the time. But unless new literary evidence is uncovered, it seems unlikely that we will be able to know much about these mysterious people. Returning to Basque, this enigmatic language of the Pyrenees is the only extant non-Indo-European or Uralic language in Europe. Today, it is spoken in northern Spain and southern France, probably a survivor of languages spoken by Neolithic Aegean farmers who spread west starting around 7000 BC. They were remotely possible, but much less likely, a continuation of some language spoken by local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. As mentioned before, there was an influx of people with steppe-related ancestry into the Iberian Peninsula, but unlike in Britain, they did not largely replace the previous inhabitants. Thus, it makes sense that some older Iberian languages survived. Perhaps if these Yamnaya-related newcomers were assimilated into the pre-existing culture and adapted the language of the majority population. In summary, although I doubt that early Indo-European speaking peoples were necessarily a homogeneous culture from the start, in southern Europe there is probably more of a synthesis of pre-Indo-European Neolithic peoples and Indo-European speakers, which allowed for some of these languages and cultures to survive into the historical period. Additionally, a civilization such as the Minoans was sufficiently advanced that we have attestations of it before it was subsumed by Indo-European people who would become Greek. This was an off-the-cuff video, but I plan on doing more thorough content on the ancient world in the near future.